Mental checking. It's not just about going back to make sure the stove is off. The physical act of returning to check is often a last-ditch effort to neutralize the discomfort that comes with unwanted thoughts about unchecked things bursting into flames, literally or figuratively. This means that a mountain of mental checking must happen first. Whenever you try to answer the question, "Is it done?" in your head, you engage in a mental ritual. Checking your mind doesn't help you know whether it's done. The mind has no new information. Mental checking is also very common with feelings and physical sensations. If you struggle with contamination OCD, you may check mentally to see if you feel clean enough. If you struggle with obsessions about violence, sexual thoughts, or morality, you might repeatedly check to see if the emotions you have in response to an event are appropriate. Like physical checking, it's typically a brief but repeated act of returning to a scene. Just as you might check your watch non-compulsively to see if you are on time, you might, from compulsion, mentally check an idea to make sure it's where it belongs in your mind. Here are some common things that someone with OCD might mentally check. Whether emotions are appropriate to an event. A mental image of a locked door or a shut light switch, and so on. A sensation in the groin in the presence of a sexual obsession. Whether a belief still seems valid. Whether a past act or intention was good or bad. What types of things do you mentally check? Mental review. What did I say? What did they mean? Where was I when that happened? How did I feel? These questions come up a lot in OCD, and you have to drop mindfulness to answer them because they require delving into an imaginary past. Whereas mental checking looks to see whether something is the way the OCD says it should be, mental review studies and analyzes it. This compulsion is also called ruminating, and for good reason. When a cow digests food, it chews it, swallows it, digests it a bit, vomits it back up, chews it again, and completes digesting it. This vomiting is called ruminating. It's appropriate, if not somewhat disgusting, as a way of describing the OCD mental process of regurgitating a thought or feeling in an attempt to further digest it. Mental review is an attempt to examine the past with the objective of letting it go. Since the sufferer believes that reviewing the event, interaction, conversation, statement, and so on, will resolve it and subsequently reduce uncomfortable thoughts and feelings, it's a compulsion. Unfortunately, mental review, like other compulsions, doesn't really work. There's no aha moment that lets you off the hook. The closer you get to thinking you've resolved the obsession, the higher OCD simply raises the standards by which you define resolution. The complicating factor of this compulsion is that the act of recalling a memory fundamentally distorts that memory. When you have an experience, you have it in the present moment, along with all of the thoughts and feelings and physical sensations that are co-occurring. When you review an experience, you review it from this present moment. That means it's a version of the past, not the actual past experience. OCD takes advantage of this by pushing you to review and review again, in hopeless attempts to get closer and closer to a mythical certainty about what happened. But it's impossible to attain this certainty. It simply doesn't exist. And the repeated digging in your head only makes you feel further and further from the truth of what happened. What are some examples of times when you typically notice that you're mentally reviewing? Analyzing hypothetical scenarios. Theorizing or hypothesizing about imagined experiences combines reviewing and checking by first replaying an event that did take place and then adding a hypothetical element of the event that could have happened but did not take place. Someone engaging in this compulsion would then proceed to analyze how he would have behaved if the feared scenario had taken place. The ritual aims at determining how appropriately you would respond in a feared hypothetical scenario, in the hopes that you'll have certainty of your moral constitution. For example, if you have intrusive thoughts about your relationship being inadequate, you may take an experience. For example, you notice a lack of attraction to your partner, and then add an imagined feared scenario, you breaking up with your partner on the spot, and then analyze how that feels, hoping that it feels bad and proves you're in the right relationship. Obsessions about violence or sexual orientation are often paired with this form of ruminating over what you would do given a specific kind of opportunity. Because the OCD knows that this is all theater, but you may feel it's an honest attempt to work out a mental construct, the result is typically some sense of ambiguity about what you would or wouldn't do. Your OCD then uses this as evidence that you're morally defective, and that the obsessions are warnings that you must take very seriously. Do you play out scenarios in your head and try to guess what you would do to feel more certain about something? Mental rehearsal. While mental review often involves replaying the past, mental rehearsal involves replaying invented visions of the future in an attempt to check for the likelihood of catastrophe. This ritual takes place entirely in the future, at an upcoming performance, encounter, interview, or other event that could go terribly wrong. This is often confused with simply preparing, but it's better described as compulsively going over and over something that has yet to happen in an attempt to relieve discomfort about what could happen. This might come in the form of repeating potential conversations in your head before a date or a meeting with the boss. While a non-OCD sufferer could do this once or twice to help boost confidence, you may look for certainty that you'll have a future experience precisely as you want it, rather than accepting that the future may bring any number of things to the present to be dealt with. When do you notice that you're rehearsing feared future events? Rationalizing. Perhaps the most insidious of mental rituals, rationalizing, may appear disguised as a simple attempt to think more rationally. That should be a good thing. The problem arises when you use it to intellectually justify making a non-compulsive choice and deny yourself the ability to learn that you're capable of being uncertain. For example, you may be triggered by the fact that you sat on your bed after sitting at your desk at work. Your OCD may be telling you that the bed is now contaminated with germs that were on your desk chair. You then may tell yourself that you don't need to worry about this because you probably didn't have anything on your desk chair, and if you did, it probably didn't stick to your pants. That is rationalizing. Or if you obsess over an event from your past that you feel guilty about and worry that it makes you a bad person, you may repeat to yourself all the reasons the event played out as it did and why it's not necessary to still feel bad about it. The difficult thing to accept about this compulsion is that, unlike many compulsions, it's grounded in a certain truth. Your rational viewpoint is probably right. The problem is that repeating it to yourself sends the signal to your brain that you must not be confident about its accuracy and that there must be more to learn by repeatedly rationalizing instead of simply feeling what it feels like to experience that trigger. While it may seem like you're simply using logic to beat your OCD, you may be walking into a trap. You can't beat OCD logic with your logic. OCD is illogical, so you can only beat it with better illogic, choosing uncertainty, and ERP. How do you use rationalization to try to feel more certain? Thought neutralization. This compulsion involves trying to focus on thoughts that are the opposite of the unwanted OCD thoughts. The belief is that a good thought will neutralize a bad one and preempt unwanted consequences. For example, you might respond to the thought, "I might hurt that person," with, "I love that person." This can come up in any form of OCD. It's an attempt not only to block the mind from accepting what it's receiving, but also to manipulate the mind into believing it's actually receiving something else. It's not a guide to rational objective thinking, as in cognitive therapy, but a ruse to the mind. Mindfulness approaches to OCD reject the thought neutralization concept because it's inherently non-accepting. How can a thought be neutralized if, by its very nature, it's a thought, and thus fundamentally neutral anyway? If thought neutralizing is a strategy you've used to deal with unwanted thoughts, write down some examples. Memory hoarding. Memory hoarding is a mental compulsion to overattend to the details of an event, person, or object in an attempt to mentally store it for safekeeping. This is generally done under the belief that the event, person, or object carries a special significance and will be important to recall exactly as is at a later date. An OCD sufferer doing memory hoarding may be concerned that moments in time will pass without his fully understanding, remembering, and appreciating them. The uncertainty surrounding whether or not he'll be able to adequately reflect upon and evaluate the significance of specific events, people, or objects causes discomfort, which he hopes to avoid. Memory hoarding can also manifest in trying to keep a perfect mental record of events to later use as self-reassurance when reviewed. For example, this might include paying very careful attention to each step of a hand-washing process, so that later you can reassure yourself that you washed what you thought you did and didn't miss anything. If you engage in memory hoarding, it's likely that you feel trapped in a state of never fully being able to take in the true value of this moment. The twisted irony of memory hoarding is that by trying to perfectly remember things, you frequently miss out on really experiencing those very things. When we don't allow ourselves to be present in the moment, we lose a great deal of life's value in the process. Not to be confused with paying mindful attention to all the present moment has to offer, memory hoarding strives to record the present moment for safekeeping and review, a mental version of attending a cherished event from behind your smartphone camera. If you engage in memory hoarding, what's the process like for you? Compulsive flooding. As a behavioral technique, mental flooding, or exaggeratedly agreeing with your unwanted thoughts, can be an effective form of exposure. Sometimes, sufferers who engage in a lot of obsessional thinking will use this technique as a form of testing their reactions to situations and force themselves to flood unwanted thoughts in specific circumstances. Because it's painful, it demonstrates to you that the thoughts were unwanted. For example, if you fear harming someone, you may force yourself to imagine committing an act of violence. The thought disgusts and horrifies you. So then you review how horrified you are and use this as a strategy for feeling more assured that you wouldn't commit such an act. Using any exposure technique for the purpose of doing compulsions, for example, checking, testing, or evaluating how it feels, runs counter to the whole ERP concept, making it impossible to habituate to the thought and simply making you more miserable about it. What are situations where you compulsively force yourself to exaggerate your unwanted thoughts to test your reactions? Self-punishment and self-criticism. Both OCD sufferers and treatment providers often overlook the compulsion to exact mental abuse against oneself. You may believe that you've done something wrong or committed some sort of unforgivable error. Or, in OCD terms, you may struggle with uncertainty about potential past transgressions. To accept that you might have done the wrong thing and move on would mean tolerating the discomfort of feeling as if you were getting away with a crime, whether the crime actually happened or not. To account for this, you may intentionally force feelings of guilt and negative self-thoughts as a form of sentencing for the crime, just in case. Once you feel adequately punished, you believe that you're more likely to move on. While beating yourself up is obviously painful, it's a relief strategy from the greatest pain you can imagine: escaping justice. Self-punishment may seem like the responsible thing to do, but it's ultimately still a way of avoiding the acceptance of uncertainty. It may take many forms, from engaging in self-critical talk to forcing yourself to endure more compulsions, or intentionally forcing yourself to remember to feel guilty about something. Self-criticism is largely a lack of mindfulness because it represents a confusion over what you can and can't control. If you're thinking, "I should have known better," then you're making an assumption that the thoughts, feelings, and conditioning that led you to this point are completely up to you. But we actually don't choose what thoughts or feelings to have, and we have quite limited influence over the behavioral choices we've become conditioned to over time. What we do have, and what ultimately does change that conditioning, is the ability to direct our attention to what is helpful or skillful now. What forms of self-punishment do you engage in because of your OCD? Mindfulness for compulsions. Mindfulness helps us to resist compulsions because it allows us to see where the seed of the compulsion is planted. It starts with the presence of the uncomfortable thought, feeling, or physical sensation. And somewhere in that space, between our awareness of the obsession and our decision to compulsively respond, lies mindfulness. Mindfulness for compulsions is the art of waiting. Just as you sit in the lobby of your therapist's office and wait for her to call you in, you sit and wait in your mind. When the OCD calls you in, you say, "Oh, I'm here for something else." When the present calls you in, you go willingly toward it. When we resist compulsions, whether it's resisting mental review, washing, avoiding, or reassurance seeking, we accept uncertainty. Maybe you should have done that thing we're calling a compulsion. Maybe as a result of your failure to do the compulsion, the sky will fall. Maybe the sky falling is what you need to get your freedom back. For every compulsion you resist, there's OCD payback. This payback usually comes in the form of extreme emotional pain. It doesn't matter if you resisted the compulsive response to a disgusting harm thought, or resisted touching the faucet one more time to get the number right. The pain is the same. Mindfulness is about seeing that pain arise and accepting it with open arms. Let it wash over you. Let it be rain that slips across you and down a gutter instead of snow that builds and builds until you are crushed and buried. Let your fear of resisting compulsions be replaced by a curiosity with what's on the other side.